us today. On behalf of My Skin Global and the Skin Positive Network, we're deeply appreciative and offer you a most grateful welcome. Looking around, I can see many familiar faces, family, peers, past and present colleagues. I just want to say it's a great pleasure to see all of you here. Today marks our second convening of the Skin Positive Network. Today we begin to learn to look through ourselves and in each other's eyes and say, you are beautiful. It is also the day we begin a conversation internally about what it's like to grow bigger than our differences and offer to everyone, regardless of the color of our skin or historical rights and wrongs, an extended hand and make a commitment to seeing and recognizing the beauty that lies underneath our different skin shades. We all are beautiful just the way we are. It is my privilege and pleasure to, on behalf of My Skin Global and Skin Positive Network, to welcome you all here. We are honored to have two amazing and well-known speakers, Nina Jablonski and our excellence and one ambassador should be joining us shortly, Matilda Mkanawena. We shall introduce them all formally as we go through the agenda. But I am so excited to start with my friend, my colleague, Charles Musiba. Charles Musiba I will introduce him and then he will introduce our keynote speaker, Nina. Charles Musiba and I sit on the board of the African School Assistant Program, and that's how we met. But previously I had met him, I had heard of him through colleagues in all the wonderful work that he's been doing in Denver and really globally. Charles is an associate professor of biological anthropology in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Colorado, Denver. He is a native of Tanzania, born on the shores of Lake Victoria in Mwanza. He was educated in Germany, Belgium, and the United States. Charles's passion has always been in prehistory, especially biological anthropology, and as a result, he received his second master's degree in biological anthropology in 1996, followed by a PhD. He is actively involved in conservation and sustainable use of something I can't read, Charles, you can say that on your own, resources, not only to small select groups, but to people and to everybody around the world. Is very interested in education and cultural exchange programs. And he will join us today in introducing Nina, who is our keynote speaker. Charles, would you please take it away?
Thanks a lot, Francois, for such wonderful and colorful sort of words about me. But my duty here today is actually to not only introduce our keynote speaker, but actually introduce one of two mentors in my life. And there are two people who actually have been so instrumental in making me become an anthropologist. And the first one was the late Mary Leakey, Dr. Mary Leakey, and then of course, Nina Jablonski, who is absolutely wonderful and a world-renowned anthropologist. I should say that Nina Jablonski is actually a world-renowned biological anthropologist who is actually recognized for her contribution to the understanding of primate and human evolution, especially to questions not answered directly from the fossil record, such as the evolution of human skin and skin pigmentation, which is actually a topic of our meeting today. She received her bachelor's degree in biology at Bryn Mawr College and her master's as well as a PhD in anthropology at the University of Washington. She has held academic positions at the University of Hong Kong, the University of Western Australia, the California Academy of Sciences, and now currently she actually sort of serves as a professor at the University of, Pennsylvania State University. Nina is actually well accomplished. She's an elected member of the National Academy of Sciences and of the American Philosophical Society, and also an elected fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. She's a recipient of an Alphonse Fletcher Senior Fellowship and the Guggenheim sort of prestigious fellowships. She has written, on top of scientific sort of work she has done, which includes describing new fossils, primates. She's also has written popular books, which actually sort of science-based books, and two of them which are actually very, very important. Skin and Natural History, which was published in 2006, and Living Color, The Biological and Social Meaning of Skin Color, which was actually published in 2012, as well as actually another important book, which is a book for children, Skin We Are, which was published in 2018. So she's a dedicated public scientist and science educator. And Nina also received an honorary degree from the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa in 2010. Why am I saying this? It's because it's so important in a sense that she's actually been a champion on human rights and fights against racism all over the world. And as a result, actually sort of University of Stellenbosch recognized her work and her contribution in actually making this world just. I mean, apart from the research interest which she has done, I should say that, for instance, in 2000, Nina and her collaborator, husband, George Chaplin, they put forward what we call the dual Klein theory, or vitamin D48 theory, for the evolution of human skin pigmentation. That accounts for why dark skin evolved under condition of high ultraviolet radiation in the tropics, while lighter skin was actually favored, and conditions of lower UVR near the poles. So of course, which makes more sense that actually people live close to the equator will have much more dark skin, and people live actually far away from the equator will be much more lighter. So, I mean, I can go on and on about basically talking about Nina's work, but I think what is very, very important is that most of her work also includes sort of looking into the effect of skin pigmentation on human health and psychosocial well-being, and the evolution of hair and hair texture, and the development of skin color and hair texture as racialized traits and human preoccupations. So her work on the history of color-based races identified key events and figures in the European Enlightenment as being instrumental in creating basically the misleading and inaccurate classification of humans that continue to influence human thinking and actions today. So again, I would like to welcome Professor Nina Jablonski to actually sort of educate us a little bit more about skin color. Welcome, Nina.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Charles, for that very generous introduction. Thank you, Francoise, for reaching out to me for this lecture. I'm going to try to compress into a relatively short period of time many years worth of work. I've been fascinated by the evolution of human skin and skin color for years, and in the last 15 years have spent a huge amount of time trying to wrap my head around people's perceptions of skin color worldwide and how this has come to influence political systems, economic systems, and social systems. It has become an enormous rabbit hole that has sort of taken over my life, but in the best way. So I'm going to take you with me into that rabbit hole for the next little while. So I hope you will enjoy the ride. One of the things that we're struck with when we look at people on a world map is that the colors and appearances of people vary subtly. And especially when we look at the skin color, they vary subtly and systematically according to latitude. This was noted many, many centuries ago by people all over the world, but it began to be written about in what we would call the Western world around 500 AD, 500 BC rather, in ancient Greece. And people began to opine about the origins of this gradient in skin color. Why did people look dark in one area and lighter in other areas? The first answer to this actually was discovered as people started looking actually at skin. This was much later in history, but as the anatomists, especially of the 17th and 18th century, began to look at skin, they realized that skin actually got its constituent color from two basic pigments called melanins and the pigment that yields the color of blood, hemoglobin. I won't go into the dynamics of these interesting molecules, but suffice it to say that of these two, melanin is the most important of the color-bearing molecules. And there are two types of melanin in the body. Pheomelanin, a yellow-red pigment, which imparts yellowy red color to hair and skin, and eumelanin. Now, it turns out that eumelanin is particularly important under intense sunlight because it is a superior sunscreen. It's a remarkable molecule that has the ability to absorb. Can you mute there? Can you please?
The bank to get money out of your
Can everyone please mute?
Please mute. Eumelanin is a remarkable molecule because it absorbs ultraviolet radiation and neutralizes its effects. It also appears dark. So people who have more eumelanin in their skin appear darker. Eumelanin is used throughout nature as a natural sunscreen. And so one of the fascinating things about it with respect to humans is that basically we just took a good thing and used it a lot in our own evolutionary history. When we look at ultraviolet radiation over the Earth's surface, this map was actually based on remotely sensed satellite data and was created by my husband and primary collaborator, George Chaplin. What we see is that the most intense ultraviolet radiation year-round is close to the equator, especially in dry areas. And when we look at Africa, which is our home, we are all Africans. We arose from African ancestry. Our last common ancestor with our primate relatives lived in Africa with our earliest relative. So we are African, and what we're interested in are African conditions here. And what we see, especially in the east and dry areas of Africa, is intense year-round ultraviolet radiation. So when we think about human evolution, this is one of our most gorgeous, well-preserved ancestors, about 1.5 million years old, from the shores of Lake Turkana in Kenya. This very, very complete individual, we can begin to reconstruct the appearance of this individual using all sorts of anatomical and indirect physiological evidence. We can reconstruct the activity profile of this individual based on the joints, for instance. And to make a long story short, we can create a sort of a pseudo skin for this fossilized individual based on first principles of anatomy, physiology, and the environment that we know this individual was inhabiting. And so what we've done, and again, I'm compressing here a few years of our work into a very short description. What we have done is reconstruct this individual as a tall, strapping, very, very active person, basically quite modern looking, except having a smaller head and a smaller brain than we do, but conspicuous in two ways and different from ape relatives in two important ways. The first, having a mostly hairless body, and second, being darkly pigmented in their skin all over their bodies. What we have seen in our study, and this is one of my favorite graphics, which I call the hairy timeline of human evolution, is that early members of our lineage living around 2 million years ago probably were mostly hairless, but they had a lot of sweat glands that allowed them to liberate more body heat in the course of their activities. When they lost their protective hair, which helped to protect them from strong sunlight, something had to give, something had to change. And what changed was the evolution of permanent protective eumelanin-rich pigmentation. And this is what we see in all of the representatives of our lineage living in Africa up to the evolution of the first members of our own species, Homo sapiens. Now, there's a lot going on in early human evolution. So again, I'm going to cut this very short and say that in the evolution of the genus Homo and Homo sapiens in Africa, there were lots of radiations, some successful species, some unsuccessful ones. Homo sapiens is remarkable for its appearance around 300,000 years ago with sophisticated technology and evidence of art, clear evidence of the use or employment of language, of complex language, and of complex technology. People lived in Africa for a long period of time, from 300,000 until just about 1,000 or 90,000 years ago. People were living in Africa, becoming fully modern. Beginning around 80 to 90,000 years ago, we see the movement of some Homo sapiens, that is us, populations out of Africa, not out of any kind of idea of there being a destination, but simply because they were after food, and food existed in the Afro-Arabian Peninsula. And people moved into the Afro-Arabian Peninsula, some populations into East and Southeast Asia. Considerably later, small populations begin to move into Western Europe and Northeastern Asia. And then much later, again, about 15,000 years ago, into the New World. We see the first Americans, Native Americans, arriving around 13 to 15,000 years ago. But what you can see here is pretty clear. As we trace their movements along this UV map, people are moving first into some fairly high UV areas, but then somewhat later, they're moving into very low UV areas where there's not only much lower UV, but it's much more seasonal. And the weather is also, and the conditions are also far cloudier in many of these northern environments. And so, to make a long story short, what we see is the evolution of loss of pigmentation in populations that inhabit northwestern Europe and northeastern Asia. This is a positive evolutionary process in that it's important physiologically for people to actually lose pigment under conditions of low ultraviolet radiation. Sunscreen is great when you live under intense sunlight year-round. It's not so good if you don't. And the reason being is that ultraviolet radiation catalyzes the production of vitamin D in the skin, which we need for so many aspects of our health, including healthy reproduction. Loss of pigment actually made it possible for people to produce vitamin D in their skin from available levels of sunlight during the summer. And in parts of the Northern Hemisphere, this is very rare and sort of the photons are few and far between, so to speak. What is interesting in this process is that in the course of evolution of our species, similar skin colors have evolved independently from independent genetic roots, as it were. We have similarly dark people as well as similarly depigmented people who have evolved independently as people have moved here and there over time. One of the remarkable things that the study of human genomics has taught us in the last 10 years is that skin color is imparted by a whole palette of genes, to use an artist's metaphor. Many, many different genes contribute to the production or regulation of melanin. And so in some populations, these have worked to increase melanin, in some to decrease melanin production under the influence of natural selection in evolution. And the fact that different genes have been involved slightly in different places is a testament to the strength of the evolutionary process and its influence on us, on people. So we can really think about skin color being a real evolutionary adaptation, a real compromise between these two basic forces of protecting against strong UV at the equator and allowing photosynthesis or production of vitamin D as we get into much lower UV levels closer to the poles. So this is basically the production of a natural gradient of skin color. So that's great, that's cool, that's interesting. But we hadn't known this until about 20 years ago. We hadn't fully understood this. Long before that, people were trying to explain and make sense of skin color. And this is where we begin to come unstuck, sort of in terms of the historical legacy, because here we see rather unscientific perspectives on human diversity coming to bear. And so what I want to try to unpack in the next few minutes is the complex and fascinating story of how people started thinking about skin color and human diversity from a perspective of the West. Although there are very interesting perspectives from China and Southeast Asia, I won't talk about those today because those have not been the world dominant perspectives that most of us have had to deal with. There are many characters involved in this whole show, beginning really in ancient Greece and Rome and Persia and the European Enlightenment. I'm only going to talk about two of them, but this is a much larger story, and I can give you some references for further reading if you're interested. These two people had very big roles in shaping our idea about humans. Linnaeus, first, the taxonomist of the 18th century, used skin color, initially just skin color, to define human groups. And so when we look at Linnaeus's first classification of human beings, according to types, not races, he labeled them as 4 types: white, red, brown, and black, according to continent. Okay, seems pretty straightforward. But things get much more complicated after that, because in the course of the 18th century, many people are thinking about this question of human diversity. And one of the people who was most preoccupied was the philosopher Immanuel Kant, who many of you will be familiar with from perhaps philosophy class. Long before Kant began writing his most impactful philosophical treatises, he was interested in figuring out how people evolved their capacity for moral reasoning and critical thinking and civilization. And he defined, on the basis of what he could learn about humans, 4 different races. Now, he didn't get any information directly. He didn't travel to discover people. He was taking travelers' accounts and explorers' accounts and trying to make sense of these things. Kant famously hardly left his sitting room, so he couldn't exactly be described as a worldly person or a widely traveled individual. But he defined 4 races, and he was the first person to use that word in German, Rassen, to describe these human groups that were physically and culturally distinct from one another. And unlike Linnaeus, he put these groups, these races, in a rank, with the white race being superior. And in this, he was very much supported by his contemporary David Hume in Scotland, who, again, another famous and very widely read philosopher, was read by Kant, and Hume's own feelings of the superiority of white people and the white race were well known to Kant, and he integrated these into his own perspective on human diversity. Significantly, the writings and thinkings of both of these men had enormous sway over public thought at the time, because influential people in Europe and the Americas were reading these works at the time. Remember, books were rare at this time, but among the most widely read in natural history circles were the works of Linnaeus, the works of David Hume, and in Europe especially, the works of Immanuel Kant. We can think of almost, sort of a Facebook-like thumbs up having been used at that time as people were circulating their works with great enthusiasm. But the fact that these people opined on human diversity and made great impressions on the thinkers of the time had a lot to do with our current situation, because the races that became associated with color developed over time into racial stereotypes, especially under the influence of the economic situation of the transatlantic slave trade. These, over time, again, morph into what I call color memes and provide the psychosocial template for racism. This is a long and complex process that I'm shortening embarrassingly here, but you get the drift. when you have a philosophy that is appealing because it's economically supported, in this case, the inferiority of Black African people because of the remuneration coming to many countries and many individuals through the transatlantic slave trade, when you have an economic reason to disempower people, to take away their humanity, well, it's easy to keep them in this hierarchy. And the hierarchy becomes reinforced in the most sinister ways in pseudo-scientific and pseudo-theological writing in the later 18th, throughout the 19th, and through the 20th centuries, lamentably. So how do we get to this this whole thing about skin lightening? Well, I've talked about this a lot in my book called Living Color. And my take on the history of skin lightening is a bit different than some, because I bring in two different forces in history that enhanced the positive social feedback, as it were, that people got from having light appearing skins, and that led to the motivation of some people to actually bleach their skin. Initially, these forces operated independently, but now they are basically completely intertwined, and you'll see why. One of the many ramifications of the transatlantic slave trade, the involuntary relocation of 14 million people from the African continent into Europe, but primarily into the Americas, including the Caribbean, and primarily, actually, by numbers, into South America. One of the great legacies of this huge movement of people is that over the course of generations, individuals, European individuals, and some Native American individuals intermix and interbreed with slave populations. And in many cases, the offspring of the enslaved people, especially in the nascent US, in what were then the 13 colonies, those offspring are more lightly pigmented. So even though they were enslaved, they were lighter, and because often they were the offspring of the slave holders, they were accorded many privileges: indoor work, sometimes, often, better food, some other privileges. Suffice it to say that within a few generations of significant numbers of enslaved people working on the eastern seaboard of the United States, there becomes a population of lighter enslaved people as a result of this genetic intermixture, mostly with slave owners. And these lighter individuals are more equal. They have better privileges than the darker enslaved individuals. The preference for light skin starts early in the history of the young United States. The second major influence, and globally, actually, this has been a bigger influence when we look in Europe, East Asia, Southeast Asia, and in Africa, but especially in Europe and in Asia. What we see are the influences of traditional agriculture throughout the agricultural world. And so we're talking about for the last, 8 to 10,000 years in much of the world, people who did not have to work in the fields would usually look lighter than people who did. They were considered to have considerably higher status because they didn't have to labor out of doors. Their look was something to be emulated. Their look was something to marry into. When we look at traditional patterns of marriage throughout South Asia, East Asia, and Europe, we see the favoritism, especially throughout Asia, of marriage partners, especially women, who are of lighter color, because lighter color assumes that you must be higher status. You don't have to labor in the fields with these poor people. So in traditional agricultural societies, independent of what's going on in the Americas, we see preference being given to light-colored people, and there is a certain level of aspiration to lightness and marrying into lightness. And so in both of these big contexts, light color becomes associated with higher social status. This is really important. And interestingly, the first sort of attempt to lighten the skin actually comes through the use of very toxic lightening cosmetics that are used in East Asia, but most widely developed actually in Western Europe, where lead-based, white lead cosmetics were applied to the skin to make it look lighter. And this was used by women and by men to make themselves look lighter, to make themselves appear to be of higher breeding, of higher social status. Later, considerably later, we see chemical bleaches being used, being developed first in the young United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and then being spread worldwide. Today, skin lightening agents, or skin bleaches, to call them by their proper name, are used more widely than whitening cosmetics, although whitening cosmetics are still used in small niche circles. To fast forward to the 20th century, what we see are skin bleaches becoming big business because there is so much personal social advantage that people can gain by having lighter skin. And we see this becoming, sort of a runaway sort of consumer, dare I say, success story. Often Black-owned businesses in the US and soon in the mid-20th century in South Africa and in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as the Afro-Caribbean, we see these businesses spreading and growing and the products propagating. These products, some of them being created, as I say, by the descendants of enslaved people in the United States, and later by people suffering under literally the whip of apartheid in South Africa. These agents are marketed as ways, especially to women, as ways of looking pretty and as of a chemical transformation to make you feel better about yourself, feel confident, prettier, more attractive to the opposite sex. Look at this. He loves her pretty, lighter appearing skin. Lots of ads about this. Also, how women are more confident and more successful if they have this lighter appearance. The code being, if you can look more like what was then the European norm, the happier you'll be. We need to recognize this for what it is, because first of all, we know that people are judged on their appearance, there is a process of cognitive assessment that occurs in all of our brains as we look at someone, and we instantly sort of assess and then judge their appearance based on our previous experience with others. And when people with darkly colored skin often are in social situations where others look at them and are slightly and possibly even imperceptibly taken aback, immediately the person with darker skin feels uncomfortable, defensive. How can I navigate this situation? Here we come to the roots of, or some of the roots of skin lightening. How can I get out of this uncomfortable situation? Well, one of the ways I might do this is by lightening my skin so that this person on the other side of the conversation no longer apprehends me as a dark person who has not only different skin, but different attributes, different potential, different behavior. By the 1950s, skin bleaches had become some of the most popular consumer products in the US and South Africa. In the US, in the Jim Crow era, in South Africa, under the nascent apartheid system. And it was at this time, especially in the US, when we see individuals using skin bleaches in some cases to pass as white, because individuals who could pass enjoyed less personal anxiety, more economic success. They were able to navigate the avenues of American society at the time easier than someone with dark skin. And so for some in the US, skin bleaches really facilitated passing. And when we look at the ads for skin bleaches in magazines like Ebony in the US and Drum in South Africa, but especially Ebony in the US, what we see are images mostly of light, happy-looking people of African ancestry who, all are shown to be successful. Some of these women in the 1950s are shown having successful jobs in these ads, as well as being successful in their romantic endeavors. So for some, skin bleaches have facilitated their being passing as white, or being close enough to white so that they are accorded a lot of the same kinds of social privileges and psychological leeway. People we know from many excellent sociological studies on this whole phenomenon over the last 40 years, that people with more lightly pigmented skin who identify as African American or Latino, those with lighter skin have a psychological easier time navigating employment opportunities, often difficult relationships with bosses or superiors. They're often regarded as more intelligent, more highly motivated, more likely to succeed. This is a terrifically injurious legacy that we're living with, that dark skin has become a penalty that can only be relieved by lessening the pigment in the skin. And so, as I said, individuals who were able to pass enjoyed considerable social advantages and were spared, sometimes entirely, the insults of segregation and demeaning behavior. Now, just briefly, the mechanism of skin bleaching is fascinating. And today, if you go to a department store or drugstore, you'll find lots of skin lightening agents. Nobody calls them bleaches anymore because it sounds far too extreme. But the mechanism of skin bleaching, there are many ways in which the skin can be lightened for different periods of time. And there's a big literature in dermatology on this. Suffice it to say that these mechanisms focus on the melanin production pathways and reduce the activity of some key enzymes, these tyrosinase enzymes, that are necessary for catalyzing reactions to make eumelanin pigment. And so there's all sorts of ways to skin this particular cat, as it were, biochemically speaking. There are a lot of different agents. The one at the top of the list here, hydroquinone, is particularly injurious to skin when used at a high concentration and used for a long period of time. It's still considered to be sort of the gold standard of skin lightening, but it can cause permanent damage in some individuals from which the melanin producing cells can never recover. There are many other types of inhibitors and antioxidants that can also reduce the melanin pigmentation, sometimes on spots, sometimes all over. This is a very complex biochemical picture, and it's really big business. These different agents bring about their lightening, as I say, in slightly different ways, using different parts of the pigmentation pathways, and some are more damaging than others, with hydroquinone and some of the old lead and mercury-based lightening agents being incredibly damaging to skin. So in this case, we see this, this woman with ochronosis caused by overuse of hydroquinone at a high concentration that has caused this permanent damage, this overproduction of melanin in a patchy patchy pattern on her skin. So, you know, what really we must get at here is, why are people aspiring to lightness when they know that skin bleaching can damage their skin permanently? Well, when social acceptance, personal acceptance, and economic viability and success really appear to be linked to lighter skin, the draw of these products is almost irresistible. So regardless of the potential for damage, people will start using them. And if they get a result that initially looks good, they will continue to use it. And if they get a lot of positive feedback on their appearance from their friends and relatives and social media mates, they will continue to use them a lot. Positive feedback from peers makes a huge difference in the skin bleaching business. But what we see as part of this whole process in the last century, especially, is the rise of now what is widely known as colorism, this preference for more lightly pigmented people in any particular group and prejudice against more darkly pigmented people in any particular group. So within African Americans, within Latinos, within East Asians, we see this potent effect of colorism. Interestingly, there has been lots of political debate within African American communities, especially about the use of skin bleaches. In the Black Power movements of the 1960s and 70s, there was great pushback against the use of these skin bleaches, with many social activists vying with marketers and manufacturers for why should we use these products? Why should we emulate whiteness in order to succeed? This tension still exists but the pressure to use these lightening agents is still very strong, largely, or at least partly, because of the irresistible press of celebrity-driven social media and advertisement. So importantly, we saw some bans on some of the most injurious bleaching and lightening agents in the 1970s and 80s. But that doesn't stop these products containing mercury and hydroquinone from being used. Hydroquinones can still be prescribed by dermatologists legally for skin lightening purposes, and dermatologists in the United States still do use this. So these agents are banned from being used in publicly marketed products, but they are still used in under-the-counter products and in prescription formulations. But, you know, if there's a demand and if people think that they're going to be better looking and happier and more successful if they have lighter skin, then banning the products isn't going to help. And in this CNN feature a few years ago, that's exactly the point that was being made. And many, many similar exposés, as it were, have been brought out in the last 5 years on the BBC, Huffington Post, you know, you name it, all of the biggest websites. Many of the modern ads for skin lightening are very, you know, modern looking, showing modern looking, beautiful, mostly very young women who, you know, who have this sort of light and refreshed look, showing the evidence of the efficacy of the skin lightening. And as I said, this is big business with a projected nearly $9 billion of revenue in skin lightening worldwide by 2024. We're well on the way to that number now. This is a big business, and many of the biggest personal care companies have highly remunerative lines of skin lightening products. And perhaps the most tragic part of this is that this lightening thing is still so popular and is still so much associated with positive happiness and social success and advancement that when women can't afford to buy the legal stuff, they'll go to the equivalent of garage sales and boot sales and buy illegal preparations, under-the-counter preparations, often with illegal ingredients, including highly toxic mercury. This was the booty, as it were, coming out of one sale in the Western Cape in 2015. All of these banned products, many of them containing hydroquinone, illegally imported into South Africa, but sold on the black market and really quite easily available if you just knew who to go to. And similarly, they're available in the United States through similar sort of back channels, and ditto for much of sub-Saharan Africa and the Afro-Caribbean. And I must say that the use of celebrities to promote some of these skin lighteners has been one of the most injurious things, because when young women and some young men see people who they really admire, who are obviously successful, who are making lots of money, who appear to be happy, who have lightened their skin and have become even more famous and more successful and seemingly happier, then the will to emulate these people becomes so much stronger. And here, one of the most interesting things is some of these young women, these young celebrities who are great influencers today. This Cameroonian pop star made this particularly, sort of interesting looking, ad showing her dramatically lightened skin. When she was interviewed, she said, "This body is my own to do with what I want." She was empowered, she felt, to lighten her skin so it could be exactly as she wanted it. And so, one has to look at the motivations for these using these products. We can think of what we would call in logic proximate causes, to feel better about yourself, to think that you look better, to look more modern, to fit in, to be more accepted, to be happier. But when we think about sort of getting deeper than that to what we would call the ultimate causes, emulating norms of physical attractiveness from the dominant world culture. Many young people, when they start using skin bleaches, are not thinking about, emulating the dominant Euro-American culture. But in fact, this is what has been sold to them. And again, to come back to this interchange, if a product can relieve that social anxiety of navigating these psychological difficulties that often dark skin brings into conversations, if lighter skin will help navigate this psychological tension, then it's easier to use the product than it is to figure out how to manipulate your own behavior when you feel so uncomfortable. So how can we learn to navigate our interactions with an unaltered appearance? As Francois said at the outset, how can we learn to regard each and every one of us as beautiful as they are? This really requires a massive pressing of the reset button, right? It's been done in sort of fits and starts with well-meaning individuals, including some celebrities over the last decade. But we now really need to do the full-on reset. We have to engage with policymakers, politicians, governments, personal care companies, celebrities. This has to be a massive movement, a human rights movement, to be as we are, to look as we are, to be regarded as human beings and beautiful as we are. This requires, in some cases, a lot of personal courage and a lot of conviction. But this is what we can all do together if we have the will. And through organizations like yours, we have new energy and hope. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Francois, for inviting me. Thank you to my supporting organizations and especially to my colleagues in South Africa. There are many useful resources. Before Francois, just one moment. I'm not trying to sell books, but my book, Living Color, which is available now cheap in many different formats, talks about this in detail, and you can always also email me. I answer, right? So I will answer you happily. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nina. That was fascinating to so many of us. Yes, I agree. I am so deeply touched by your presentation. It affirms the journey that we are on at My Skin Global and the Skin Positive Network. Because the reason why this is called My Skin Global is simply because we perceive this to be a global pandemic that has been about, just referencing everything you just said in your presentations, been around for generations. And it's about time that we do something about it, that we engage in one-to-one conversations, that we start within ourselves, right at home, within our friends, within our local electeds, national and potentially international. And so with that, I just want to open it up to you guys for if you have any questions, comments for Nina. Nina, I'm simply I don't know how to say it. I am honored to have you here and to be in your presence. Thank you so much. So with this, I will open it up.
Okay, great question here about skin color preferences in India. Is Indian light preference rooted in Aryan invasion and push of the Dravidians to the south? Yes, in part, but not just that. That's a big part of it, but also within traditional Dravidian culture, there is preference for more lightly colored individuals who don't have to work out of doors. So both the so-called Aryan origin populations and Dravidian populations exhibit this sort of typical agriculturalist pattern. And this has persisted and has been further elaborated within castes. So this is quite fascinating and tragic. The story of Indian skin color attitudes and skin lightening warrants a book of its own. But this is a problem that is big and is not just due to the Aryan invasion. It was there and has just become further elaborated over the last 2,000 years of the hardening of the caste system. Let me just see, I've got to roll up with the, I talked about slavery in the Americas as being one of the origins of the preference for lighter skin. What about slavery in the Middle East and Saharan Africa? Yes, we see this preference especially in individuals who are the offspring of lighter colored, mostly Europeans, and darker colored people of African ancestry. So this same pattern does exist in the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa because there was complex patterns of intermixture, of genetic admixture as a result of the slave trade, not the transatlantic slave trade, but the predecessor to the transatlantic slave trade that involved the circum-Mediterranean. So we do see this preference for more lightly pigmented skin in those areas as well. And another question, some recommendations of what people are doing to address this issue. Oh my goodness, there are so many people out there, from movie stars to, dermatologists to, social activists. And Francois, you can probably answer this question far more capably than I. There are lots of people working to reduce the popularity of skin lighteners, to reduce the positive images of lightly colored people or the dominance of lightly colored people in advertising and the media. This is very, very widespread. Francois, you might want to add to this.
I think you articulated it really well, Nina. They are activists, they're doctors, they're movements really happening around the world, trying to voice out for this very important issue. And like I said in the beginning, you need to find one of them will start with us right here, and let's build together in recognizing that this is just the only way, beginning this conversation and really being real about it, being upfront about it, recognizing the beauty in our differences is going to be the way to move forward. So that, yes, there are networks, there are doctors, dermatologists, networks, groups like ours that are dedicated to putting an end to this at some point. Thank you, Nina.
Thank you. A question, did slavery color Linnaeus and Kant's views? Really good question. To answer it directly, Linnaeus, I have been laboring to find a direct connection. I think he was minimally influenced by this. He really got his information from some of his students who were traveling more widely, who were observing people in their natural environments. And so Linnaeus had relatively good information. Kant, on the other hand, was profoundly influenced by the kinds of interactions he saw between light-colored Europeans and dark-colored Africans in a European context. Most of those people were enslaved and had demeaning lower social roles in European society. And he did get some of his views on the basis of the behavior that he observed, as well as from explorers' tales and travelers' tales. There's a lot that's been written about Kant's own experience with Africans and Africanism, and I can't really go into this here, but if you're interested in this, the translations of the philosopher Robert Bernasconi, who is particularly interested in Kant on race, I would commend those to you. Let's see. Is racism not the ultimate excuse or ideological foundation of slavery, a way of profiting from others? Of course. Of course, it's the ultimate excuse. Yeah. I mean, it becomes this incredible sort of self-reinforcing system, by the mid 1800s in the United States. Racism was a well-established, respectable system of, science and theology that we would now recognize as pseudoscience and pseudo-theology. But people were competing to come up with the most comprehensive and persuasive arguments about the superiority of the so-called white race and the inferiority of the Black race. So, this racism created the races, and racism was really was the fuel in the engine of the transatlantic slave trade. Who is owning the skin lightening companies? They started out as being sort of mom and pop cottage operations in the US and to some extent in South Africa, fairly small industries. Most of these now are owned by the big personal care companies, Unilever, Procter & Gamble, L'Oreal, and others. There are still smaller brands, but the big players are there. Can you comment on the Cheddar remains? This Cheddar Man remains and skin color perception in the UK, and how such discovery could help us deconstruct skin color-based racism. For those of you who study or who may have listened to the BBC a few years ago when there was a big expose about the first inhabitants of the UK had dark skin. This was really a huge news. And the remains of this so-called Cheddar Man from Somerset had been identified and genotyped. The DNA had been sequenced and the skin color reconstructed as being very dark. There have been some questions about this particular interpretation of the genetics. I won't go into that. But what we now recognize, and this is a great question, is that the last phase of skin depigmentation in Homo sapiens did not occur until the last few thousand years of human habitation in far northern latitudes. And basically when a lot of people started engaging in agriculture. Early people like Cheddar Man and his relatives who could eat vitamin D rich foods in addition to being able to make some vitamin D in their skin from available UV in the sunlight, probably were able to survive okay. Although some of those populations almost certainly became extinct if they couldn't get vitamin D rich foods. So there was great diversity in skin pigmentation, but as populations became increasingly dependent on agriculture and had no vitamin D to speak of in their diet, maximally depigmented skin became more the rule than the exception in the extreme northern latitudes. Okay, what are the native people around? Oh, I love it. These questions, it's like you folks read my mind. The native people around the Arctic Circle in Alaska and Canada, darker skinned. Interestingly, they do have slightly darker skin, but as soon as their skin is exposed to natural sunlight and they become considerably darker. They have excellent tanning abilities. East Asians, and especially people, Native Americans in Alaska and around the Arctic Circle, Inuit peoples, have excellent tanning abilities owing to different pigmentation genes, part of this artist's palette of genes, as I was referring to them. And so these folks actually become quite a bit darker when they're exposed to summer sunlight that is reflecting off of the water and off of snow. Now, it's not a problem for them because they eat such vitamin D rich foods. Their natural diet is marine mammals, oily fish, and basically all animals, all vitamin D rich animals. So they're replete in vitamin D. Their skin pigmentation had a lot of latitude, as it were, to darken in response to this tanning or this UVB insult that they receive in the summertime. Already 100 years after the Virginia Slave Code, dehumanization simplifies exploitation, of course. And when you read this, you know, in the history of the state of Virginia, in the history of the American South, in the history of the American colonies, the dehumanization of Africans made it much easier to exploit them in every way. And in South America, where we often don't, you know, reference very much in the US, in South America, the less than human status of Africans made it easier to just abandon them, work them to death and not feed them. Don't worry about them surviving or reproducing. We can get more from Africa. The dehumanization made it possible for these individuals to be discounted entirely. So, you know, this is a horrible legacy, and we have to learn how to talk about this with our kids. We have to learn how to educate people in a constructive way, not confrontationally, but basically telling the story. This is the way it was. Things aren't painted in a particular way. we know better now through many lights being shown on the history of the Americas, what actually went on. We can tell this story now dispassionately, and we can begin to right some of these wrongs, but it will not occur without this tremendous press of forces coming together. Is the big push for mixed couples another way forward to BIPOC's proximity to whiteness? Well, I mean, yeah, some people think about it that way, you know, and, you know, what I like to think of is that when people come together and engage in sort of, you know, educational stuff together, cultural stuff together, when they just are together, they want to be together. And so, okay, there might be some level operating in some people about, you know, sort of, you know, marrying to become lighter, to get, you know, a lighter lineage. But I think most people get together because they like one another, because they have a lot in common. That, and what I see around me, in the young people around me, is people are spending less and less time obsessing about these physical characteristics than they did even 20 and certainly 50 or 100 years ago. They want to know about the person that they're with. What's inside this person? Is this a good person? Is this somebody I really want to be with? Let's see, I'm just paging down in the questions here. Oh, I think I'm at the end of the questions.
I think so. What an amazing conversation. Charles, I saw your hand up. Are you still, you still have a question?
I think he may have thrown in the towel, so to speak, because of the mute problem.
But you can now unmute yourself, Charles. Yes.
Actually, you answered that question already. I was actually thinking about, as an anthropologist, I think about how do we make this world better? And I use some of these discoveries as evidence to suggest otherwise. And the Cheddar Man was actually the question I had, and what's your perspective about that? Because yes, there is a lot of sort of different interpretations in terms of the evolution of skin color, not as particularly the evolution of skin color, but actually the interpretation on those remains about the genomic work.
Yeah.
Because there are more than one gene which actually sort of responsible for skin pigmentation and melanism.
Yeah, and you know, what sort of irritated me at one level about this report was that it wasn't a peer-reviewed report when it made this big splash on the BBC, which was, you know, bad form, to say the least. And they were looking at very few skin genes. And we know that many different genes contribute to darkness and lightness. And so if you don't look at this whole group, it's hard to get a comprehensive and accurate picture. And this is a problem for forensic reconstructions today as well. So it's just important to inject a cautionary tale. But that's not to say that there weren't people in the UK and throughout Europe who were much darker until about, you know, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago, when agriculture really became extremely widespread and the dominant form of sustenance, of gaining sustenance. That's when you see this real sort of last push of natural selection to reduce the amount of dark pigment in the skin.
Thank you.
Okay, Francoise, thank you, everybody. I'm going to leave now and hope that you have a really good, productive rest of your discussion. And I wish you all of the energy in the world. Get going.
Thank you so much, Nina. We're
Involve
grateful.
everybody.
Thank
Just move with energy.
Thank you.